That's why we did the baseball analogy is we've got kids that come in at all different levels. We've got kids that are already on third base ready to get home. And then that kid's the one that often sits in the dugout longer. And yet that's the one that should be rounding the bases. And we, for the first time in years, have the ability with technology to have so many different coaches with a teacher, and I kind of want to look at the computer as a tool to coach kids to keep them going and not have to stop. And so we do know who's on first base and what that kid needs next to get to second. We also know that kid that's constantly at third base may be missing some of the fundamentals on first and second base because they fly through it so quickly. And so just knowing where they're at all times is kind of the biggest piece of it for me, and not having kids just waiting in a classroom for what's to come next.
How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin, and how do you develop the mindset and skills to be successful? You're listening to Designing Schools, and I'm your host, Dr. Saba Kidwai, educator, researcher, and storyteller. Join me each week for stories and strategies that bridge the gap between research and practice, as together we explore how might we design schools. How might we get every student out of the dugout? You don't have to be a baseball fan to recognize the incredible analogy today's guests are using to frame a critical challenge in education. How do we move away from a one-size-fits-all model to one where learners have the agency to be architects of their own learning experiences? A statement that's true, by the way, for both young and adult learners. Today, I'm taking you to the Davis School District to meet Robert Kinghorn and Amy Thompson. During Robert's 5-year tenure as principal at a Title I school in Clearfield, Utah, working alongside the teachers, they transformed the culture and raised academic outcomes, nearly doubling student proficiency rates on end-of-level state testing. Amy's been an educator for 18 years. While teaching in Salt Lake City School District, Amy was formally recognized as an exemplary teacher based on student growth and proficiency results. She's also been an instructional coach and an assistant principal. Amy's currently teaching upper elementary students coding and technology skills. During the 2019-2020 school year, Amy and Rob worked together as the new administrative team at a Title I school. They wove together their own experiences and understanding of best classroom practices and developed the Out of the Dugout instructional framework. In their book, they share, during each inning of a baseball game, 2 teams rotate between batting and fielding. The team that is on the field includes the pitcher, the infielders, and the outfielders. Meanwhile, the team that is up to bat sits in the dugout, while each player takes turns getting up to bat. They say, imagine that our students are the team that is sitting in the dugout, taking turns at bat. As students learn, they're getting up to the plate, hitting the ball, rounding the bases, and scoring runs. But unlike baseball, where players are required to sit in the dugout, waiting for their turn at bat, we can design classrooms where each student is constantly getting up to bat and rounding the bases of learning. Getting every student out of the dugout and continuously engaged in just right learning activities is the central challenge of running an effective classroom. How can we meet the needs of each of our 20-plus students, they ask? I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with Rob and Amy, and so I asked them to begin with sharing how a principal and a teacher came together to not only lead a school, but to go on to publish a book.
So I had been an educator for 14 years, and I was moving into leadership roles, and I had a national coach, and I was new to the Davis School District. Most of my experience had been in the Salt Lake City School District, more urban. And I had heard rumors of this guy, Robbie, who was doing really amazing work in high poverty school. And so I was curious. And one of the rumors I'd heard is that he loves personalized learning. And he is really big on flex seating. And these weren't like completely new to me, but I wasn't sure okay, but then how is he getting these amazing results where he more than doubled student proficiencies in a school? So I was so curious. And as luck would have it, he and I got moved into a new school together as he was the principal and I was the assistant principal. And I think, some of the underlying expectation was we want to see these results again. And so I was really excited and curious and terrified of what was going to happen with that kind of weight of those expectations. And then as we started working together, I saw that Robbie was pulling together some of the most important, I don't know how to say this exactly, the most important conversations and reform efforts that I had, seen as an educator in the last 20 years. So things like project-based learning and embedding supports, but it was done so that I've come to think of it like you can't just emphasize one thing. You can't just only emphasize students having self-support, so some social and emotional learning, because that is part of becoming a competent, independent learner and having these experiences of a learner that are very targeted to your needs and strengths. So I saw that there wasn't this separation or easy way to describe it. And so then as we worked together that year, we had a lot of conversations and he kind of frames things around this sports metaphor of baseball. And so we came together and created this framework.
I started in ISES schools and I loved it, but it wasn't my thing. And so I got into some title schools and found out that was kind of my niche where I fit in really well. I got into a school that was a turnaround school. And through that, from day one, I learned a ton from the principal and the whole administration that was constantly in the school. And we were turning the school around, but it was from the state level. That school successfully turned around, and then they brought me to another school in which we just had real conversations on here's where we're at, here's what the data says. And even though we saw great strategies in the classroom, the data wasn't supporting it. And so we had to talk about how do we ensure that the data also follows what we do. And, within a couple of years that happened. And then, like Amy said, over to South Clearfield and being put there with the same thing, just saying, you guys have been successful. And as a whole, you've been really successful, but how do you replicate what you've done? And so we're really having to think through that replication thing. And I think the one thing really that it comes down to is, we talk about building trust. And from day one, it's working with every single person that's in the building and saying, where have you been? What have you been doing? How did we get to where we are? What are your visions for the next 1 year or 5 years? And then also then bringing all of that together and saying, okay, as an entire school, these are the things that are common. And these are the things we need to focus on. And when we focus that way, we can start day one with change, because there's often this feeling of, hey, you can't change anything for the first year as an admin. You need to go in and kind of be quiet and get used to the culture. But on the flip end, I think people expect, hey, if there's a new principal, we need to have a little bit of their flavor here too. And so, just going into the school, amazing educators, they were ready for what was next. They just needed the resources and the tools to do it. And so it was us asking, all right, what do you need? We're going to go this way in this direction, but how do we, as educators, how do we support you with that?
I just want to say that I'm watching that in our year. We only had a year together because of the pandemic, and I had a kindergartner and a second grader heading into the scary year. And so I homeschooled. So we only had that year together. But one of the ways that I've come to recognize the specific way that Robbie can promote that kind of change really fast is through his very authentic relationships with all of the people in the building. And I think that sometimes I would think of that moving into a new model. So with more personalized learning, people would be afraid of change. But what I watched with Robbie is they're not really afraid of change. So a lot of people are excited about change, but they're afraid of losing something. There's this fear of loss. And so there's a little bit of grief, I'm not going to be as in tight control of what my little people are doing all day. And, it's that it comes from that commitment that educators have for their students, that fear of loss, what am I going to lose in this process? And so Robbie is really amazing at understanding that, empathizing, and helping people kind of through that fear.
One of my favorite parts in their book, Out of the Dugout, is the emphasis on how they cultivate a mindset within learners that's centered on growth, belonging, and agency. It's one of the things that as adults, I don't think many of us had exposure to growing up in schools. And as a result, it's why so many of us struggle with navigating change. They share specific strategies in the book about how to deliver feedback that nurtures this mindset around growth, belonging, and agency. I bring this up because we just heard Rob share a critical question. How do you replicate what's already been done? And how quickly can this happen? In sharing his response, he highlights one of the foundational elements of a transformational leader: building trust to inspire a collective vision. He did this by asking one question, one that we don't ask often enough. What do you need to be successful? This one question builds strong, authentic relationships amongst teams in school. As Amy highlights, people aren't afraid of change. They're often afraid of loss. In asking this question, Rob is asking, you create this shared narrative about change that's inclusive. I'm curious to hear more. And so I asked Rob, what should leaders be focusing on to build this alignment and trust across their teams?
Honestly, I think that people get focused on their vision of what they feel like things should be too quickly. I there's a lot of things that we could focus on in any building that we're in. But I think that if we look at that collective whole and where can we get the most gains and what's the strengths in this school, and then how do we really focus on those strengths and go from there. And then across the board, you've got teachers sharing with different grade level teachers, and you've got them wanting to do, walkthroughs of the school and see different classrooms and what's happening well there. And I think it's that piece of it. And knowing that as an admin, this isn't my school. Like, this is our school and this is our vision. And the second that this becomes fully me, focused on one thing, I think that I'm going to lose traction, because they're going to jump through hoops and they're going to do it just like the rest of us, right? If we're told to do it, we're going to do it. But if we're asked, hey, what's next and how do we go about it and how do we support you? Like, if I'm asked that as an admin, then I'm part of that. And I feel like it's the same thing of we support with where we need, but keeping that guiding vision in place, making sure that that's still the ultimate place we're going and not losing sight in that as well, which sometimes can easily happen.
Absolutely. Do you feel like this was a culture that people were already used to, or do you feel like this is something that you kind of had to create a little bit of nurture?
Specifically where I'm at, I think that culture was there. Previous to, I don't think it was there as much. I think that the culture that I stepped into was educators that are just truly incredible and just needed that extra, that yes, I've got a voice in it. And yes, I've got, they're there and they're involved. But yes, when I'm asking for supports, I know I can go ask for that support. Or if I'm worried about something, I can say, hey, I'm worried about this piece of it. And I guess having those open conversations and knowing that it is a collective whole that we're doing this, and that even though some of the conversations are hard, and we have hard conversations, but at the end of those conversations, we know it's about kids, and that's why we're talking about it. And as adults, we need to put ourselves second to what's best for kids, and then focus on ourselves on how we can get there.
There are two ideas that Rob highlights for us. First, how do you identify people's strengths? Now, I want to share two tools that I find serve as a great catalyst to providing the language and mechanisms to begin this dialogue with your teams. The first one is free. It's the Spark type assessment from Jonathan Fields. I'll link the assessment to it in the show notes. The response to his assessment highlights a core question that we don't ask often enough. What energizes you at work? I find that this is a great starting point for teams to begin to develop that individual self-awareness around what energizes them and around what their strengths are. The second one is Clifton Strengths from Gallup. It's a more advanced assessment that provides you with your top 5 strengths. But more than that, it then goes on to give teams the language to discuss how to utilize these strengths together and how to respond to each other based on their different strengths. The second topic that Rob highlights for us is the importance of having a culture of psychological safety. This was a term coined by Amy Edmondson, whose research on this topic defines it as psychological safety is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. It's that type of culture that allows for people to have the very types of open conversations that Rob and Amy are highlighting for us as we navigate change. There's also an assessment you can take to determine the level or degree of psychological safety within your organization. It's really short. It's only 7 questions, and the survey is online for you to be able to distribute out to everyone in your organization. And I will link that for you in the show notes as well. Now, the change that Robbie and Amy are creating was around personalized learning. However, that term has a different meaning to everyone. And so I asked Robbie and Amy to share what personalized learning means to them.
So I think that it's learning that's tailored to the individual strengths and weaknesses of students and their interests. And I think that specifically, we look at ways that we have technology tools that can help us. And that's not just, but it definitely includes adaptive platforms, but also teacher designed playlists that kind of walk students through something that ends with a student created product. But then what that also opens up when you have a lot of that happening in a classroom is a space for teacher to do individual and small group work that's also personalizing the learning. So it is pulling together all of that. And I think that technology piece is something that made us feel an urgency about kind of getting our framework out and entering this conversation right now because of the hybrid and remote learning. And so many people so many students were getting this chance to work more independently at their own pace. And at the same time, we were working closely with educators who were really struggling. And so we wanted to have a conversation about, well, what is it that we can keep and what is it that we're excited to never have to end? So we want to be in a space with other people. I think we all learned that is really a valuable part of schooling. And yet we don't want to throw out, the 7-minute short videos that a student can pause and rewatch again. So I think that all of that kind of fits into the timing of this.
I think, for me, when we go way back, for me, personalized learning was number munchers. I hated math, but I could destroy that game. And so the knowledge was there, but if you made me sit down and do an actual assessment, I wouldn't do it because I just wasn't interested. And that was my initial, when we first got into this world in around 2012 of oh my heck, look at all of these things that can happen and how we can change education and not just have kids go into a computer lab and it wasn't even self-pacing because they just had to go through a program. And all of a sudden, technology really, in my world, started to change where we can assign individual strands to kids and we can have all these different things happening and then pull the data. And so I've seen the last 10 years that everything's changed where we can actually see what's happening with those kids, like Amy described for personalized learning, but then we can grab that data. We know where they're at in the moment. Then we can go on to the next steps on small groups or whole groups where those kids can go, do their independent work and create their own, truly their own projects. That world's changed. But I think going way back, just thinking about a lot of kids that they just want more and different opportunities and they don't want to have to sit and do worksheets or, hey, go read the book because you're done or, which just causes behavior problems in classrooms. So I guess if you talk definition for me for personalized learning, adding to what Amy said, just students having the opportunity to learn at their own pace, of course, and on their level, but also that ownership piece is huge. Because they can actually take that and we'll get far more out of them as soon as they take ownership over their learning.
What can we keep? What can we leave behind? These were questions that many people asked over the past 2 years. Yet many have also shared that once they returned to in-person learning, many of the answers to these questions were ignored. It's a topic that Nima and I discussed in detail on the podcast last week. As someone who grew up loving math, Robbie's example deeply resonates with me. I talk often about how my experience with school dramatically changed when I was in London and then moved to California here in the United States. I really grew up loving school, being happy in school. And when I moved to the United States, I found that it was just very drill and kill. I found myself bored and I found myself extremely frustrated. Sure, I might have had the knowledge and the grades, but what I lacked was that intrinsic motivation, that passion, that joy, and that interest. I soon became extremely bored at school. And that desire for ownership and agency is exactly what led me to quit my IB AP program as a junior in high school, take the high school exit exam, and head to community college. As they share in the book, when students are given choices, and are also given opportunities to share their unique voices, they are not only motivated to complete learning tasks, but they also become confident, self-directed participants in their own learning. As Amy shared, having a strong vision can often mitigate from many of the struggles that comes along with this type of change. Having a vision that all students should have agency and autonomy over their own learning is something that we hear often. Yet the devil lies in the details. How do you create cultures of trust amongst students, teachers, and leaders, where everyone can thrive under this new vision? To do this, Rob and Amy began by defining what agency and autonomy for learning meant at the intersection of knowledge, skills, and mindsets. For knowledge, they asked, what do expert learners know? For skills, they defined, what do expert learners know how to do? And for mindset, they asked, how do expert learners approach learning? Designing these experiences for learners can feel confusing and overwhelming. So I asked Rob and Amy, what were the struggles they experienced in implementing this vision for personalized learning?
I think definitely the pandemic put it on steroids. It was, we were pacing ourselves and we had our vision, but overnight everything had to change. And so because of that, some grade levels and teachers that were leading out were already ready, when it just happened, and others really had to push themselves and had to figure out what does that look like for us. And again, with the support of anyone around them, because it was hard and there were a lot of tears and there was a lot of conversation of this isn't why I went into education. But we had to say, okay, but if it's best for kids and what we have to do, let's look at that and how do we get to that final point and kind of, again, bringing it back to that final vision. So I think it's just supporting every individual teacher with where they're at and ensuring that those resources are in place. So we've got a teacher, specifically at our school right now, that's taught in the same building for 32 years. And she's one of the ones that will lead out. And she's one of the ones that's willing to do anything to a point, because she also wants to see, okay, is this going to work? Because she's seen so many things in that period of time. While we've also got teachers that have been, 2 to 5 year teachers, and they're also leading out. So we've got them all over the board. But I think what it looks like for them is ensuring that we have a systematic approach school-wide that looks the same, so that kids know that the expectation in all classrooms, whether it's first or fifth, that looks the same. But also that teachers have a little bit of autonomy within that to say, okay, this isn't working right now. We need to pull back or talk or change that piece of it.
Another hurdle, I think, and this is kind of like where I entered it with Robbie, it's just that really clear vision. And so one of the things we did early in our first year together, maybe right in the middle of the year, was take teams of teachers to go and observe at another school where they had some of these things a little bit more in place, just so that we could be clear what we're even going for or aiming for. What does it look like to have less of a lecture-based approach and more personalized, student-centered happening? So
we had one that came in, and he's still with us, but from day one, behaviorally, he was on our radar, and we didn't know what was going on. Calling parents, and they're like, hey, this didn't happen in the last school. And we ended up figuring out it was because the academic, they thought he was a lot higher academically than he was. And he came from a school that the focus wasn't necessarily on academics. Certain schools in our region can focus on arts or outdoors or, and those types of things. And so we found that there were some gaps there. And within a week, we had him plugged into our systems. We had him on his levels, and we slowly saw these problems decrease, because it was no longer, do I have to compete with everybody in my classroom? And do I have to look at this kid who's over here that's excelling, or this kid that's not? I get to truly be on my level. And, it was just, I think, one of those moments of realizing, hey, even kids that are coming in mid-year and brand new to our school, which we have all the time, if we can get them in on their level, they're not concerned so much about where am I at academically within this classroom. I get to come in and I get to really learn. And, the teacher that he had, though, was also just incredible. The fifth grade team that I had, they brought him in, they talked with him, they worked with him, they showed him how our systems work and how within a structured environment where he's on his level, he can thrive. And, we saw that behavior that increased and then decreased again right overnight, which I think that's what I was discussing a little bit earlier about the decrease in behaviors, because, students don't want to feel less than at any point. Nobody does. But if we can help them see that, hey, we're all in different places and learning, and we're all on this journey together, it changes that.
I want want to acknowledge that some of you may be thinking or will be confronted by those who are thinking, I could never do this with 30 students. Or perhaps you're in an administrative role. Having this conversation on top of everything else going on might feel daunting. When I think or hear these sentiments, I'm often reminded of Will Richardson, who says, if you seriously want to change the way your school lives in the world, start by changing the story you currently tell. And I think it's really important that our stories begin more with how might we, instead of there's no way we could do X. And a really big part of that is being able to use frameworks such as the design thinking methodologies, frameworks, and strategies that allow us to navigate this very type of change. Robbie began by changing the story of what they valued in school by discussing 6 core thinking skills: ask questions, build new knowledge, create models, communicate with others, conduct experiments, and design solutions. They share in their book that most people feel projects that encompass these skills feel overwhelming because they're often framed with jargon and rarely obtainable features. They want everyone to start with simple goals that expand and evolve over time. So I asked Rob and Amy to share how they approached this conversation with the teachers at their school.
I think that's the biggest fear. Exactly what you just said is how do I do it? And I'm by doing it, I'm going to lose everything that I've known that has worked. And for some teachers, it has worked. And so looking at that, but then also, focusing on if we're going to be able to get our kids, how do we help you as a teacher? How do you see that vision for you in your classroom and grade level? And so focusing on if you can get your kids to where you need them and then get those smaller groups, you're going to get more time. And as much as it sounds like you're going to lose time, you end up having so much more time with your kids throughout the day. You have more time for that individual connection with every single kid because students are behaving. You're not focusing on as much class management. There's a lot there to initially get it set up, but then it's not as much. And so now you're focusing on the academic and social side of things within a classroom and how that works. From an admin side, and this is with teachers working with us, we had over 50% decrease in office referrals the first year that we were there. And it was huge. And so now we've got kids in class more. They're not coming to the office. There's a lot of components to that. We've seen that increase right back after kids came back from COVID. I think that they were just, they'd been at home and we've got to get structure in place again. But as an admin, I think it's if you can focus on this and focus heavily on it, you're going to be able to focus as a school on academics and not all of these little things that keep coming to you behaviorally. And not just, we're talking in an elementary world, but this is junior high and high school too. I can see a 12th grader sitting in a room being bored, and then they're going to be the class clown and destroy every bit of learning that would have happened instead of being able to focus where they need to go.
Circling back to some of the hardest parts of this change, I went into the school that Robbie had come from and did an observation day. And I was in this 3rd grade classroom where the teacher was in the corner with a group of students, just in a really, tight small group lesson on whiteboards. And around her room, there were kids sitting next to each other on their laptop devices doing some kind of math activity in Minecraft. And they were kind of loud. And they were joking around with each other and pointing at each other's screens. So there's this change in teacher mindset that can make space for that sort of student freedom. And I recognized in that moment that teacher is having a really powerful learning experience for those 5 kids in front of her. But my teacher instinct was all about, are those kids across the room on task or not? Right? So there's this shift in control. I'm going to trust that those kids that are off there on their Minecraft math journey are fine, that they're okay. And that even if they're talking and laughing, that's okay. And I'm going to get some of this tight focused learning on the kids at my table. It's just a shift in how you think of your role as a teacher in the classroom and what you trust your students to be able to do.
I think that's probably one of the hardest things is that trust that kids are going to be on task and doing what they need to do. But also knowing that, probably sometimes they're not going to be. And sometimes they might be in Minecraft goofing off. But at the end of this, 20-minute period, if they've been able to produce an authentic project and if they've been able to say hey, this is what shows you that I've mastered this thing, great, And I think even the forgiveness of even adults. You know what? Sometimes in meetings, adults are on their phone too, but at the end of it, they know everything to do, and they're going to be able to go out and finish the final product. So,
or if they're not, that's a lesson too. And it's a really valuable lesson, right? Like if you spent your whole self-direction time off task and laughing, and that happened for a week, well, then we look at your goals and we see where you are, and you're learning really important life skills in that failure, in a supportive environment where you have a trusting adult coach teacher who can help you reflect and change and do better. So I think that even when they aren't able to, accomplish their goals for the day, that's valuable. And I think that's kind of like the Dugout model where we set those home plate outcomes. I'm often thinking about like coupling the mindsets that we're going for. So that growth and that agency, like I can't learn that I can't learn to set goals and how to meet my goals if I never fail at doing that, right? Like I think that's part of that importance of being really clear about those long-term outcomes for kids.
Rob shares that just the very idea itself is the greatest fear. How could I possibly create a personalized experience for the learners in my classroom? What I appreciate the most is how he emphasizes what teachers need to be successful in this transition. It's a question we rarely ask, and when we do, it's often only from a knowledge perspective. Professors Richard Clark and Fred Estes wrote a book called Turning Research into Results, where they present a conceptual framework that helps determine the causes of gaps between performance goals and current performance levels. They argue that 3 ingredients make up our performance levels: our knowledge, our motivation, and the organizational environment we work in. Whether it's implementing a new curriculum, a new technology initiative, or any other type of change, we often focus only on the knowledge aspect and neglect the motivation and organizational influences needed to help increase performance levels. It's your classic catch-22. You don't believe it till you see it. Let me take you back to another clever baseball analogy that they share in the book. A big 3-week project with an authentic outside audience that solves a real-world problem while integrating multiple subjects is like playing in the World Series, they say. We might get there once per year, but we don't play in the World Series every day. We don't even play a real game against an opposing team every day. Our daily work is showing up for practice. In baseball, this means batting drills, fielding practice, and getting with a single partner to throw the ball back and forth, playing a calm round of catch. This daily practice, they say, prepares players for the variety of situations that may arise in a game. Now, I've read you a few excerpts from their book, which I find so practical and so easy to read. So I asked Rob and Amy now to share more about their book and the framework that they've developed.
So I think that one of the main reasons we wrote the book is to help develop that collective vision so that we can have common language and a common kind of purpose and understanding of the why of this kind of more personalized model. And so it pulls together baseball metaphors, starting with the title, which is Out of the Dugout, which is this idea in baseball that when a team is up to bat, most of the little players are sitting in the dugout doing nothing while one kid is up at home plate. And so the idea in classrooms is we don't want anyone sitting in the dugout. We want those personalized learning structures to be in place so that all kids are getting the instruction they need at the right level and are around the basis of learning. So I think then a kind of critical piece that we start with is defining what the long-term outcomes are. So we start with the question, what does a 6th grader who leaves us in our region, it's K6 is our standard. And so when our 6th grader leaves us, what do they look like as a learner? What does an expert learner look like? And then how do we foster those long-term outcomes along the way?
Yeah, I just, when we're looking at the ultimate goal of it, it really was like, how do we get more systemic change in our area? Because I feel like we're very, we see things throughout. And, Amy and I are very heavily research-based in what we're doing. We're reading what's going on throughout the nation as much as we can get that information to us. And we just wanted to get kind of like, hey, here's something that's working for us and we're seeing it work. And our teachers have worked really hard to get it to where it is. And we see this as something that can hopefully change not just where we're at, but in other places as well. And that's the whole hope. And going back to what you said earlier in terms of like, how do teachers go about this and it doesn't become too overwhelming? Amy and I could have had 200 pages in this book easily, but we decided it was too much and it was too overwhelming. And to sit down and read this, they would have walked away feeling like, great, this is truly one more thing, where this is more just a small approach on, okay, this is step one to get you to where you need to go. And then from that point, once they see that, once they start it, that they won't stop, because it's one of those things where just that tiny grain of like, oh my heck, it's working. They're going to be digging in and getting more. And it's just trusting themselves that they have the ability to do more and change. But then also as soon as that happens, it'll shift their pedagogy overnight.
Self-efficacy. It's a word we don't acknowledge often enough when designing initiatives around change. It's the belief about how effective you feel you will be at performing a task to achieve outcomes. Now, it's quite possible that we could be great at executing on a task. However, if we don't believe we are, if we don't feel as if we are, then the knowledge doesn't really matter. It's why it's important to consider the motivation and mindset aspects of change initiatives. A strong sense of self-efficacy ensures that not only that we acknowledge the change, but that we will also persist in developing this idea and working towards those goals. One of the things that's really important is that we continue to see educators as learners, affording them with the same opportunities for engagement, feedback, and reflection so that they can continue to experience success and maintain high levels of self-efficacy. Alongside self-efficacy, they also discuss the importance of building a culture of trust amongst learners in their classroom. I asked Rob and Amy to share how they helped their teachers develop this strong sense of self-efficacy towards designing personalized learning experiences.
So it was happening before March of 2020, but then it, amplified on steroids. We asked teachers to make playlists, and we defined that a little bit loosely. That might have just been a series of adaptive platform things that kids needed to complete, but the kids would pick the order, would pick the place in the room. So just opening up a little bit at a time, the student agency, right? And then once the March 2020 happened, then that really quickly became kind of the central anchor of what kids were doing during the day and how teachers could organize learning. They also began to really share with each other those playlists. And so then going into the next year, in our area, we were only hybrid for less than a month. And then kids were back 4 days a week, full time. So we were really fortunate to have kids in front of us for most of 2021. Or I'm off my years now. Is that right? Is that the year we're just finishing? So anyway, then we moved into more of a conversation of what we can do to improve playlists and what different, how we can make sure that students, for example, are meeting the standards and learning the content and can say the knowledge, but they could demonstrate that in a variety of ways.
And I think, that goes back to that. Our teachers were being creative. They were using everything that they knew to help build this. We had a math coach, an ELA coach, and a technology coach that were heavily involved with all the teachers and helping with the whole thing as well. And then we took the best of what we were seeing across the board. And that's why some of the stuff that we have a ton of stuff at our school and it's on our website, but it's stuff that was created by our coaches and by our teachers and what we saw in different classrooms, and we were adjusting it. And that, and we just put that out there for, other schools to use, but it's not it's never about us, right? It's about what can we do to build other schools and other kids as well. And so I think taking the best of what's happened, and that's happening right now in the school. We're still adjusting things, we're changing things. Teachers will come and say, hey, look at what happened in this point, and we changed this little bit of our playlist that we're doing as a school, and we're getting more success out of it. And so then we present it, we come back, and as a whole, we're like, hey, let's look at this. And we've had a couple meetings this year so far where they're sharing out what's working and what's not, and we're building. And so I think we've got teachers that are at all different levels, but they're willing to look at it and share. And then, recognizing those accomplishments that, these teachers are doing really well here and we're doing really well here. Let's combine that and see how that works, where it's not competitive. It's all of us together.
That's where I feel like as a nation, or even as a world, we're in such a critical juncture where we could share our, best teaching so widely. So as I was homeschooling, I also pursued this dream I'd always have of learning to code. And so I took this course on Udemy by Angela Yu, who is this person who started a boot camp in London a few years ago, and she would charge people $10,000 to come and do a 6-week course and learn coding skills. Well, now you can buy the same course for $12 on Udemy, and it's an incredible course of, hundreds of hours of instruction. And she's an amazing teacher. And so I feel like we are in such this opportune moment to find really best practices and teachers and instruction and videos and put that in front of kids. I'm a little bit more outside of the district right now and the mainstream stuff that Robbie's still in, but I'm really excited right now about how we could really have more chance for more kids to have that opportunity to learn from the best instructors in the world.
Whenever I hear about how people are designing change initiatives, the first question that I'm always curious about is, what does teacher collaboration time look like? You'll often hear me share one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Wanda Austin. In her book, Strategic Leadership in a Complex World, she shares that leadership is not accidental, that in today's complex and global world, we have to make this time and the space to come together with our teams as we design change. And so I'm always curious, how are people making the time and space for teachers to come together, to experiment, to discover, to apply, and to connect and share ideas with one another? So I asked Robbie and Amy, what does teacher collaboration look like?
So they're talking all the time. But structurally, they meet once a week in a PLC for 45 minutes. And so that's all set where that's going to be there. But it's ongoing conversations. And we've been fortunate enough where we're at that they built a new building for us that we've stepped into. And so we literally have private offices for teachers to meet and as a grade level collaborate in there as well. And so that's been a really sweet part to have an addition to what we're doing. But it goes back to what we're still working on. You can have the best building around, but if you're not doing, if you're not using best practices, the building does nothing. It's just a shiny something for everybody to look at.
And the same PLC questions that we've been using for 15 years, right? I think that's one of those things we don't lose. How do we know students are learning? What's the evidence of student learning? Which students have learned, which students haven't? Anyway, those DeFore PLC still are kind of the heart of it.
And Amy, I think that's important because we had gone, I think, a little bit too far with, okay, here's some questions and here's some stuff we have to answer. And we brought it back to those 4 questions on, okay, if we stay focused on these, we can, in a 45-minute session, if we want, in 45 minutes, we can get through it. If we want to spend more time, so be it. But we know in that period of time, we can do that. And going back to what I said earlier, 10 years ago, we didn't have, I felt like we didn't have the ability to pull the data like we have now. And so in that moment, instead of them taking all of that data and putting it into another form, we just say hey, we looked at iReady data, or we referenced this data from a cadence, or whatever it is. We're looking at data, but we're not having to spend all the time to reload it into another form because it's a waste of teachers' time because it changes the next week. It's different again.
And I feel like that format and that data really can open up the innovation and creativity. Okay, so we know this is what is happening. Here's how our playlists are working, or here's how this small group of students is struggling. So then those PLC conversations are, how do we support those learners?
We've learned a lot so far from Robbie and Amy. We've heard about this incredible framework. We've heard an incredible vision for what's possible in creating an environment where learners have more agency over their experience. So now I ask them to share the hurdles that they see and how we can overcome them.
I think for me, that piece that Robbie said about once teachers have tried it, have opened up the space a little bit where students are more self-directed, that phenomenon that he described where they get a taste of it and then it changes their practice forever. I think I've seen that. I think it's true. I think that leaders, school administrators hesitate to ask teachers right now to do anything different or more. I think that it's a hard time for everybody. And I think that we can do better for kids. I think that we always are looking for those ways to serve more kids better. And our little subtitle is every kid, every day. How do we do that? And I think that this small changes can lead to big places.
Yeah, again, like I think that a lot of teachers are still, even in my current school, at that place where, what do I do first? And even though, a first may have looked different in different classrooms. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is, very first, I would say, how do you know that your students, how do you know if they've accomplished that? And how do you know that they have those skills? For those students that then don't have those skills, what do you do as a teacher with those groups? And then for those teachers or those students that do, what do you do with those kids? So if those kids, we look at that 80% mark, if you're hitting 70 to 80% of your kids know it, what do you have ready for them secondary to prove and show their knowledge about what you just taught? Because otherwise we're teaching anyways, because we don't have the majority of the group. So what are we going to do for those kids so they can independently be working while you pull a small group? And then for those kids that are independently working, as soon as they're done with whatever project that is, what's the next thing you have for them so that they're working on their individual private, their personalized level? And then so it doesn't stop. There's a sequence of things that they need to accomplish and do. And then as a teacher, you can still be doing your small group and know that, even when they're done with that project or whatever it might be, that doesn't mean that they're going to be come back to you and disrupting the group, because there's always something to do. And I think even just taking those couple small steps can then build out to a lot more. And then I guess having the trust in your kids, trusting that, that they're going to be on task. And again, if they're not, then they lose the opportunity to sit where they want in the classroom or work with a friend or whatever it is. I think that's step one, though.
Just to emphasize again, I think that we're afraid of asking people to do more. It's a stressful time. I was so excited about this model and some of the opportunities with technology. I'm back in the classroom. I'm teaching a technology class 10 hours a week and then still learning to code and supporting my kids. But I love being in the classroom with this model. And so I feel like, yes, you're asking teachers, you're challenging them, but what you're going to give teachers and students is joy and learning. And that's beautiful thing to give people. So I feel like there's that motivation for leaders to push.
What should I do first? And I love in particular how Robbie highlights that a first is going to look different in different classrooms. They share some excellent guiding questions that we can start with. Ultimately, though, they say it doesn't matter where we start as long as we start somewhere. Amy is correct in highlighting that at this particular moment of time, we are definitely hesitant to ask more of people. Yet I wonder, are people frustrated by what is being asked, or are they frustrated because they are often being told? Earlier in the episode, Rob highlighted the importance of asking, what do you need? And the importance of creating a shared narrative around change. It's not just about asking, what can we do and how can we change and what new initiatives can we adopt, but it's also about asking, what can we take away? I had the privilege of delivering a keynote in 2019 for the Davis School District, where we talked about the value of using design thinking to navigate change. So I asked Robbie and Amy to share how they've used design thinking as they approach the change that they created in their school.
Just that starting with the end in mind and thinking through that question of what do we want our students to be able to know and do when they leave us? And then I think that one of the ways that led to this book is teachers have to make tons of decisions every day. And there's this real phenomenon of decision fatigue. And so having those end goals really, really clear, I think helps teachers make those decisions. So for example, when we're moving into a more personalized learning model, one of the questions that will come up for teachers is, what if, kids make the wrong choices or are off task, or I don't know what they're actually doing when they have self-direction time. And so if we have those long-term outcomes that we want our kids to be developing self-efficacy and kind of agency mindset, then we're going to say, I can afford that time because it's leading to those long-term outcomes. So that whole, the day-to-day work that I plan and the experiences that I designed for my students are connected to this kind of big long-term vision of what we want for all of our kids when they move on to middle school.
And I would say, like, when we're focusing on, that's why we did the baseball analogy, is we've got kids that come in at all different levels. We've got kids that are already on third base ready to get home. And then that kid's the one that often sits in the dugout longer. And yet that's the one that should be rounding the bases. And we, for the first time in years, have the ability with technology to have so many different coaches with a teacher, and it's kind of what I look at the computer as is a tool to coach kids to keep them going and not have to stop. And so we do know who's on first base and what that kid needs next to get to second. We also know that kid that's constantly at third base may be missing some of the fundamentals on first and second base because they fly through it so quickly. And so just knowing where they're at all times is kind of the biggest piece of it for me, and not having kids just waiting in a classroom for what's to come next. And I think that our universities and colleges have set up teaching so often in a way that we're at the front of the class, we teach, students should get it. If they don't, we pull that group, and then the rest of those kids are just kind of there. And it's restructuring that whole thing so that we're always, as teachers, we're supposed to be learning and growing and focused on us. And that's the same as students. So they're always knowing that we're learning and growing and focused on them. And back to that Abbott and Castillo script of who's on first. We know who's on first, and we know how to get that kid to second. And then as a teacher, how do we do that without overloading them?
And then I think the other systems and kind of design thinking is back to that PLC and whole school change model, where we're clearly saying that we want people to talk about what can your students currently know, or what do we want students to be able to do, and what will they learn, and how do we respond if they don't, and if they already do know this, then what are they going to do? So having those clear kind of data-informed innovation, where we've got the data that comes in, but then how do we innovate while still going for those long-term outcomes for kids? So I think the other design systems thinking is at that school level. Like, we have all of these different teams, we have our long-term vision for kids, and how can we play around with some of these personalized learning models to get us all there.
One of my favorite breakdowns of how to think about motivation to achieve performance goals is by Dr. Robert Rueda. He's a professor at the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. He defines motivation as a process where goal-directed activity is instigated and sustained. He says 3 elements are critical when examining an individual's motivation. The first, he says, is active choice, because this determines whether one decides to choose one task over another. The second, he says, is persistence. This determines one's commitment to the task in the face of other distractions. And third, effort. This determines the desire to exert the mental effort needed to continue learning. So I asked Rob and Amy, what is the one non-negotiable to consider so that we can develop the intrinsic motivation as we navigate change?
It's going to be difficult for teachers as they head down this road if they've not done it yet. But if you can get your grade level to work with you and do it together so that you're sharing as a whole what's working and not doing it on your own, that's going to be far better. I think it would be difficult for a teacher in a silo to do this. But if they're willing to talk to a group of teachers within their school and say hey, let's give this a go and let's see what can work, because then it's that shared collective vision on we're doing this together. And it can work alone. And I've seen some teachers do it, but then it gets very difficult because they've got so much ownership over what's happened and where it's at that often they're not willing to look at, okay, how do we change this? Because they don't want to change it. They've done so much work to get it to where it is. It's no, this is how it works. And so I think as a whole, that's what we've seen as a school is everybody has taken ownership over this is us as a whole and how we do things. It's not just a document that this is the best way to do it.
We cannot do this alone. It's a powerful message and one that needs to be repeated over and over. So as we contemplate how we're going to work towards changing the narrative of education, let us make the time and space to create cultures of innovation that begin with a culture of empathy. Let us better understand the fears and motivations of those we work with. And when thinking about our goals, let us consider the knowledge, motivation, and organization influences to be successful. I invite you to visit outofthedugout.com so that you can get a copy of their book. I'll also link it for you in the show notes along with their contact information. It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Designing Schools community. Leaving a review for the podcast helps others learn about the show, giving them the gift of knowledge and allowing this community to help create access and exposure to ideas and opportunities others may not even know exist.